Today's session is a special in honor of Shavuot. Shavuot's message, Torah, Yetzer, HaRa, and Self-Actualization. Admittedly, not an obvious combination, but I hope it will be justified by the time we complete our discussion. When I say Yetzer HaRa, for those who aren't familiar with the term in Hebrew, we best translate that as either evil inclination or drive toward evil, an internal mechanism, the origins of which we will yet be discussing. But before we get to that, we embark on our journey with an interesting dissension that we encounter in the Gemara, in Tractate Pesachim, also in Tractate Beitzah, a dissension between the Mishnaic sages Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua as to how one should conduct oneself on Yom Tov, on the holidays. That is, does one dedicate the entire Yom Tov either to eating and drinking, or alternatively to study of Torah, to spiritual pursuits, or the alternative of Rabbi Yehoshua is that one should bisect the day and spend half of it on eating and drinking and half on spiritual pursuits in the house of study. The Gemara goes on to elaborate that they are both expounding the contrast between two verses, one that speaks of Aseret Hashem Elokecha, the other Atzeret Tichye Lachem, whether it should be a convocation for God your Lord or a convocation for you, whether that means that you have a choice of either of these two alternatives or that one should combine the two, is the subject of the dissension. But then the Gemara adds a later comment by the Talmudic sage Rabbi Elazar. While this applies to all other holidays, Hakol modim ba'atzeret deba'ena namli lachem. Everyone agrees that on Shavuot there must be that gastronomic self-indulgence. That is, according to Rabbi Yehoshua, of course, that would apply to every Yom Tov, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, you cannot spend Shavuot exclusively on spiritual pursuits. There has to be that indulgence in eating and drinking of all holidays. Why? Why? Because Yom Shnit Nabo Torah. Because it's the day upon which the Torah was given. Now, you'd think that, if anything, if the reasoning is this is the day upon which the Torah was given, and by the way, Rabbi Elazar appears to be the earliest source that explicitly enunciates that the Torah was given on Shavuot, then maybe make it a categorical imperative to spend some time on Shavuot studying Torah. It sounds like a good idea, but that's not what Rabbi Elazar is emphasizing. He's saying there has to be that gastronomic dimension. There has to be the physical indulgence. The spiritual indulgence is something that is an option, but it's not required. And the Gemara goes on to further exemplify this point by citing the example of Rav Yosef, who on Shavuot would have a particularly sumptuous feast, the justification for which he expressed as, were it not for what that day, the giving of the Torah, caused, there are a lot of Yosefs in the marketplace. That's what make me who I am is the fact that the Torah was given, and that leads again to this indulgence. So there's clearly a theme here of self-actualization, and arguably it is indeed something that pertains to the activity of the Yetzer HaRa. We'll note here a definition of the Yetzer HaRa that is supplied by Rabbeinu Abraham ben Rambam. Arguably, what he tells us is intimated in Rambam, in Moreh Nevuchim, God of the Perplexed, in the commentary on the book of Job that occupies unit 3 of the guide, chapters 22 and 23. But Rabbeinu Abraham, his son, makes the point more explicit in stating that Yetzer Tov, which we usually translate as drive towards perfection, drive towards good, is da'at. It's the intellect. The Yetzer Ra ta'avat haguf, is the lustfulness of the body, physical desire. Again, clearly, what Rabbi Elazar bids us to address specifically on Shavuot, because the Torah was given then. To try to understand what's going on here, I'd like to share with you another ostensibly bizarre passage from the Talmud. Appears in a couple of passages in the Babylonian Talmud, the Yerushalmi Talmud, and the Midrash as well. It is arguably directly germane with respect to this coming week's Torah portion when we read about the Nazir, the Nazirite, who refrains from anything having to do with grapes and anything having to do with death. No defilement by reason of exposure to a dead body. And the Gemara reports that Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik of the last remnants of the Great Assembly, one of the earliest sages in the Talmudic period, states the following, as recorded in the Baraita contemporaneous with the Mishnah. I always, he was a priest, refrained from eating of the guilt offering brought by a Nazirite who had become defiled by reason of exposure to a dead body. Now, as the Torah prescribes it, inasmuch as the Nazirite is forbidden to come into contact with a dead body, if inadvertently such contact takes place, he brings the offering, the guilt offering for this inadvertent defilement, and he needs to count over again. So, by way of example, if a Nazirite takes upon himself the standard oath of a 30-day period, then after, say, 20 days, he finds himself inadvertently in the presence of a dead body, he needs to start counting the whole 30-day period again, which means it'll be a total of 50 days, not 30. That figures in the explanation of what's taking place here. Shimon HaTzadik goes on to tell us there was one exception to his refraining from partaking of the consecrated meat of the guilt offering of an Nazirite who became defiled. Once a man came to me, a Nazirite from the south, and I saw that he was a handsome young man with beautiful curls. Now, of course, at the end of the period of being a Nazir, the hair all gets cut off. So he said to him, my son, what do you see that prompted you to destroy your beautiful hair? And he said, I was a shepherd for father in our city, and I went to draw water from the fountain. And of course, the fountain was not just the source of water, it was also the local mirror. And I saw my reflection. And my Yetzer, the Yetzer HaRa, sprang upon me and sought to drag me down out of the world. A colorful description of the urge to sin by virtue of his good looks. And I said to it, to his Yetzer, wicked one, why are you glorifying in a world that is not yours? In one who will be in the end worms and decay. I swear I am going to shave you off. It's the Yetzer, but it's talking about his hair. For the sake of heaven. Whereupon Shimon HaTzadik arose and kissed him on the head and said, my son, may those who take upon themselves the oath of being a Nazir proliferate if it's like you in Israel. And inevitably the question after this story is, so what indeed rendered this Nazirite unique? Rabbi Mani asks, what's the difference between the guilt offering of a defiled Nazir that Shimon HaTzadik didn't eat? If you're going to say it's because it comes over a sin, the fact that he was defiled, even if it was inadvertent, then he should refrain from eating of any Asham guilt offering. To which Rabbi Yonah responds, no, it's not because of it coming because of a sin inadvertently committed. It's because what usually happens is people in some state of shock, remorse over their bad deeds, take upon themselves the oath of being a Nazirite. But when they become defiled and they have to keep more days than they originally committed themselves to keeping, like in the example that we used, instead of 30 days now it becomes 50. They regret having gotten into the business in the first place. And it's as if they are bringing unconsecrated offerings to the temple courtyard. Of course, the offerings are consecrated, as the Ran expresses it in his commentary on this passage. Of course, as long as they have not been absolved of the vow of being a Nazir, their Nazirhood indeed continues, and they are obligated to bring these offerings. But it's as if there's something that is unseemly in the offering that they're bringing, because in as much as their intention is no longer noble, their offerings are also undesirable. And Shimon Tzaddik did not want to partake of that. Now the Gemara goes on to ask, well, what about a Nazir who never became defiled? He could still regret the fact that he took upon himself the oath. And the response of the Gemara is, no, for the 30-day period or whatever period the Nazir took upon himself, he had already established it wasn't in such a state of temporary insanity. He knew what he was doing. He took upon himself the oath with full intent. But when the time period suddenly became significantly greater due to the defilement, that's when the remorse kicks in, which of course necessarily raises the additional question that the Gemara doesn't explicitly address, and that is, so why was Shimon HaTzadik at peace eating of the consecrated meat of this guilt offering brought by the Nazirite who came from the south? And to this, the Ran responds that with this man from the south, there's no need to fear the undesirable intentions, because in as much as his intention was so positive at the outset, we're sure he had no remorse. Now, what exactly was so unique about his story? And inevitably, the highlighted line is significant. This is an interpretation I once heard from one of my mentors in understanding this passage in Gemara, that when he, as it were, addresses his Yetzer HaRa, his drive toward evil, what he has to say is not, don't glorify, it's unseemly. But don't glorify in this. If you're going to glorify, at least glorify in something that has some consequence. Why are you glorifying in a world that is not yours? In one who is, in the end, to be nothing more than worms and decay. If you're going to glorify, if you're going to indulge in self-actualization, be real. That's what converted Shimon HaTzadik. That is the realization that you need to establish the appropriate relationship, as it were, with your Yetzer HaRa. And, it's in that vein that I'd like to consider, at least briefly, an interesting metaphor for the Yetzer HaRa and its implications. Already at the beginning of the first tractate of the Talmud, tractate Berachot, we encounter the metaphor of the Yetzer HaRa as Se'or Sheba'isa, the leaven in the dough. The leaven in the dough is an add-on. It's not the essence, after all, of a flour-water mixture, and it's what makes the dough rise. And that becomes the metaphor for the Yetzer HaRa, and indeed, where we encounter in the Torah, in Parashat Noach, Genesis chapter 8, God's evaluation of the Yetzer HaRa, that the Yetzer, of the heart of man is evil from his youth. The Midrash comments ruefully, Amar Rabbi Chia Rabba, Aluvahe Yisa. Woe is the dough whose baker testifies that it is bad. Now, we find essentially the same metaphor also the next line. Woe is the leaven whose creator testifies over it being bad. We find the more prosaic description of the Yetzer that is called bad by God himself, but we note in particular this metaphor, the leaven in the dough. And of course, inevitably, what that metaphor invokes is a fascinating contrast. You know, obviously, we are only 6 weeks past a time frame regarding which the Torah says, for 7 days you shall eat matzah, and from the first, tashbitu se'or mibatechem. Get rid of leaven. No leaven at all in all of your habitations for all of the days of Pesach. We'll note, besides the universal prohibition of leaven, there's also a year-round prohibition on leaven in one particular location. And that is, when you bring a meal offering to God in the Holy Temple, it shall not be made leavened, because neither leaven nor honey shall ever be brought as an offering for the fire on the altar. Only the leaven and the honey can be brought as a korban reshit, a first fruit offering, but not brought upon the altar. No leaven at all upon the altar. To what does this first fruit offering refer? The Talmud responds in Tractate Menachot, the 2 loaves that are brought to the temple on Shavuot. Those 2 are specifically to be leavened. As for the honey, there's also a Shavuot connection, because the first fruits include dates, consider date to be a source of date honey, and that's brought as a first fruit offering to the temple as well. Neither of these, of course, go on the altar, so it's not a violation of Leviticus chapter 2, but nonetheless, they're brought into the Holy Temple. And what is of paramount importance for us to appreciate is what that conveys to us with respect to the leaven. That is, Rashi in his commentary on Menechot notes this. This is explicit in Parashat Emor, Leviticus chapter 23, the commandment regarding the 2 loaves that are brought to the temple on Shavuot. You shall bring from your habitations these 2 wave loaves, 2 of them, each one to be an isaron, shnei esronim, and they are to be made of fine wheat flour and baked, leavened, as a first fruit offering to the Lord. So just consider this remarkable contrast. On Pesach, no leaven whatsoever, anywhere. On the altar, no leaven any time, any day at all. And then you have Shavuot, in which not only is leaven consumed, but leaven is, well, not brought upon the altar itself, brought as an offering, the only public offering the whole year that includes leaven. What is it telling us with respect to the identity of Shavuot? Now, again, we already noted the metaphor with respect to Pesach. That is, the prescription on all leaven on some plane is to put the squelch on the Yetzer HaRa. On some plane, recognizing that you have just emerged from bondage. And to be able to, in this new state of liberation, properly address your various faculties, including the Yetzer HaRa, is fraught with danger. So cut it off. No leaven whatsoever. And that's good for 7 days. But that's not the goal. The goal is you indeed bring the leaven back into your life. And on Shavuot, you bring it as an act of consecration. The leaven, again, as the stand-in for the Yetzer HaRa. Now, what is this telling us about the Yetzer HaRa? Clearly, despite its name implying drive toward evil or evil inclination, it is not necessarily bad, which indeed is an inevitable conclusion. The Mishnah at the end of Tractate Berachot tells us that the imperative to love God your Lord with all of your heart means with both Yitzarim, both drives, both the drive towards good, towards perfection, and the drive towards evil. And while there are those who would understand the manner in which you love God with your Yetzer HaRa as you're negating it, you're avoiding it, not so Rabbi Menachem ben Shlomo HaMeiri. The Meiri, in his essay on repentance, emphasizes that this Yetzer that we associate with the negative aspect of life is ultimately that which pertains to your striving for your physical needs. That level of indulgence ultimately needs to be dedicated towards loving God. And it's not something to be prescribed, not something to be avoided. There's a level of self-actualization that is not only redeemable in principle, there's a summons to redeem it in practice. Likewise, Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz in the Tiferet Yisrael commentary on the Mishnah makes the same point, that with those domains of lust towards physical indulgence, one's intention should be for the proper arraignment of your body for the sake of heaven, to strengthen one's body for the service of God. And that indeed, as he emphasizes in the Boaz portion of his commentary, that on the contrary, one needs to express one's love of God through harnessing the fire of the Yetzer HaRa to inflame himself, to engaging in mitzvot, to doing good deeds. So the Yetzer HaRa has a critically important role to play. If you ask, why altogether do we refer to it as the Yetzer HaRa under such circumstances? So this is, of course, a longer discussion, but what I'll at least note in passing is clearly the Yetzer HaRa is a prodigious source of energy. When you have a prodigious source of energy, if you don't do anything to channel it in a positive direction, it's a bomb. It's explosive. It's destructive. Think of a bull in a china shop. Alternatively, perhaps on a more rigorous plane. Nuclear energy, is it good or bad? Depends how you use it. Stick it in a reactor with control rods and channel it appropriately. It could provide almost limitless clean energy. If you don't control it, it becomes a nuclear bomb of incalculable destructive power. So when it's in isolation, it's Yetzer HaRa. It is a drive towards evil. It is an evil inclination. There's something bad about it. We might indeed translate Yetzer HaRa as just the bad drive, because if you don't do anything to control it, it's going to be bad. But if you do control it, well, on the contrary. Just consider in Midrash Tehillim, commenting on the verse in Psalm 9, Odeh Hashem bechol libi. I thank God with all my heart. With all of my heart, says the Midrash, means with my Yetzer Tov and my Yetzer Ra. In Midrash HaNe'elam, which is part of the corpus of Zohar literature in Parashat Toldot, the Yetzer Ra is as necessary for the world as rain is for the world, because were it not for the Yetzer Ra, the exulting in Torah study could not be. And commenting on the final grade of the story of creation, Vehine tov me'od, God saw all that he had done, behold, it was very good. What is that very good talking about? One of the answers that the Midrash in Breshit Rabbah proposes is the very goes on the Yetzer HaRa. And if you ask, the Yetzer HaRa is very good? The answer is, were it not for the Yetzer HaRa, people wouldn't build homes, nor get married, nor have children, nor engage in business. In a somewhat different, but perhaps more telling formulation in Midrash Tehillim, commenting on the same turn of phrase of very good, that this is the Yetzer HaRa. The Midrash says, were it not for the Yetzer HaRa, people wouldn't get married, nor have children, and the world would not endure. So there's a critically important role for the Yetzer HaRa as well. In order to understand just what that means, we need to go back to roots. What is this Yetzer HaRa? And whence does it come? Fascinatingly, according to Rashi, in his commentary on the Torah, when we read that the first man and woman, Adam and Chava, were naked and unashamed, Rashi tells us that they didn't know the way of modesty, to distinguish between good and bad, even though they had an intellect. That is, naming the animals already took place, but still, the internalization of the Yetzer HaRa took place only by dint of eating of the tree of knowing good and evil. And the Yetzer HaRa enters, and they knew how to distinguish between good and evil. What does this mean? Let's consider the seduction of the snake. Regarding the tree, in Bereshit, Genesis chapter 3, God knows that on the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. V'hitem kelohim yodei tov vara. Now, how to translate this is not such a simple question. And as we'll see, there are different opinions. You will be like Elohim, knowing good and evil. Elohim meaning what? On the one hand, there is Onkelos's original Aramaic translation, who renders it as Tehon kerav revin chachmin ben tavavish, you'll be as great ones, knowing to distinguish between good and the evil, with the realization that Elohim is not necessarily a divine name. It could also have a mundane sense of any source of power that is Elohim. If anything, we extrapolate from the mundane usages of Elohim to Elohim as a divine name, the ultimate transcendent source of power. But any mundane source of power can be called Elohim. So overlords are called Elohim. Great ones are called Elohim. Judges can be called Elohim. So again, Onkelos understands this in a mundane sense of the term. In much the same vein, in tractate Sofrim, collection of Baraitot, which tells us how to relate to the rules concerning the inscription of the Holy Torah, we are given in a similar vein, explicitly, the same distinction in regarding the first occurrence of the name in the verse, Ki Yodeh Elokim, God knows, as a holy name. But that you will be as Elohim, Tractate Sofrim tells us, is not a holy name. It is rather a mundane sense of the term because it doesn't have any reference to God in it. We'll note that Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, in Guide to the Perplexed, second chapter thereof, where he talks about the anatomy of the sin of Adam and Chava, explicitly cites Onkelos's comment and indeed supports it that we are not referring to becoming like God. If anything, from Rambam's perspective, the human intellect in its pristine form prior to the sin is that which represents the greatest commonality, as it were, between man and God, but rather great ones, not referring to God. That's true as one side of this coin, but there's another. In Bereshit Rabbah, which of course is one of the most venerable of the Midrashim, there is explicit voice given to an alternative view that when the serpent seduces Adam and Chava to eat of the tree, he begins by, as it were, bad-mouthing his creator. He says, God ate of this tree and created the world. And he says, don't eat of it, so you won't be able to create worlds other than this one. Because every artisan hates the other artisans in his own trade. Now, clearly, even if it's unstated, what underlies the premise of the Midrash is V'hitem Kelohim is not a mundane sense. It is, you will be like God. In Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer and the number of other Midrashic sources, this is rendered explicit. That the seduction was, when you eat of the tree, you will be like God. Just as God creates worlds and destroys worlds, so you too will be able to create worlds and destroy worlds. Just as God is able to put to death and vivify, so you too will be able to put to death and vivify. You will become like God. And we'll note here a more obscure Midrashic source, which is cited by Ramban in his commentary, Pirkei Rabbeinu HaKadosh, that speaks of three who spoke the truth and were punished for it, were lost to this world and the world to come. There are different versions of the list of three. But in Ramban's version of this Midrashic statement, the first element on the list is Nachash, serpent. It spoke the truth. Said to be like God. It's a true statement. And it was punished for having made that statement that it wasn't supposed to have made. But now, is it true or is it not? One could well argue that the ultimate approbation for the words of the snake come from God himself, because after man has eaten of the tree of knowing good and evil, God the Lord said, man has become as one of us to know good and evil, implying that indeed some kind of commonality has been established between man and the realm of the divine. Now, this is also a fraught question, because Onkelos true to form avoids rendering Hein ha'adam haya ke'achad mimeno, as we'll note, grammar seems to dictate, as man has become as one of us. He rather bisects the verse in an unconventional manner and says, man has become as one, unique in the world. Mimeno, being understood not as from us, but rather from him. Two usages of mimeno. From him it is to know good and evil. And indeed, in the same vein, we find Midrash HaGadol saying, Ke'achad means man is unique in the world. This idea is also ostensibly affirmed by Rashi in his commentary, that man is unique in the terrestrial realm, just as God is unique in the heavenly realm. Although admittedly, there is something of ambiguity in Rashi's commentary, because just as, not so clear. Rambam, in his introduction to his commentary on Pirkei Avot, the 8th chapter introduction, the Shmona Prakim, the last chapter thereof, explicitly understands the verse as Onkelos renders it. Of course, one could well argue that this is Rambam consistently following Onkelos' lead, as he did with the previous verse as well. He likewise expresses essentially the same idea when he considers the implications of this verse, of God's statement with respect to human free will in the 5th chapter of the laws of repentance, or again, min zeh adam haya yachid ba'olam, that man is unique in being endowed with free will, and he explicitly associates that with this verse, ha'adam haya ke'achad mimenu. Man has become as one in the sense of unique. But that's not the only track for understanding this verse. In Bereshit Rabbah, again, one of the most venerable midrashic works, we have ke'achad in the conventional sense of the word, the construct form, as one of the ministering angels. Possibility number one, that could be as one of us. And there's also the possibility of ki yechido shel olam, that man has become as one with God. There's a unique divine endowment that takes place by dint of man eating of the tree of knowing good and evil. This is likewise enunciated in other midrashic sources in Shir Shirim Rabbah and the other cognate sources that explicitly understand man has become godly. This likewise is an idea enunciated in the corpus of Zohar literature, in Tikunei HaZohar, in Midrash HaNe'elam. We won't go through all the sources inside because it would take us too far afield, but suffice it to say, there are certainly quite a number of sources we can summon that will simply read the verse according to its plain meaning. And that it is the plain meaning of the verse is perhaps best corroborated by Rabbi Abraham ibn Ezra, of course, of impeccable credentials as one of the foremost grammarians, who notes that ke'achad, spelt with two patachim, is not the same as ke'echad with a segol. Ke'achad is the construct form. Doesn't mean as one, it means as one of what follows. Ke'achad mimenu, as one of us. And indeed, parsing the verse in that manner is similarly, unequivocally corroborated by the pauses established by the cadence of Ta'amei Mikra, the tropes. The pause is after mimenu, not after achad. And so, to that extent, Ibn Ezra affirms in his conventional version of his commentary here, and in the Shita Acheret, the alternative version of the commentary as well, he wrote more than one extension of his commentary, that the statement that God is making is, as it were, the utmost approbation for what the snake had said. V'hitem kelohim, yodei tov v'ra. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. This idea is perhaps most elaborated upon by Ramban in his commentary, the commentary on Bereshit, on Genesis chapter 2, verse 9, where the tree is introduced. And inevitably the question arises, so what is the identity of this tree of knowing good and evil? And with what does it endow the one who eats of it? So we already saw Rashi's interpretation, the internalization of the Yetzer HaRa. Ramban gives an alternative view. We'll still need to consider whether it's really an alternative view or an alternative way of saying the same thing. That da'at, which we usually translate, of course, as knowing, is an expression that pertains to will, desire. Ramban provides ample verification that that is a legitimate rendering of what da'at means. So there's a desire for good and evil that is engendered by eating of this tree. And by consequence, indeed, Ramban, in reflecting upon what preceded the sin, that Adam and Chava were naked and unashamed, notes that prior to this internalization of ratzon, of desire, Adam and his wife did not regard sex as something that was the object of lustful desire. It was simply a natural function. And as a result, the sexual organs were no different from faces, hands, any other limbs that are employed in normal natural function. And they were unashamed because they were invested with a whole additional dimension of meaning. And after eating of the tree, now they have desire. And it's desire for both good and evil, both for themselves and for others. And that, says Ramban, is on the one hand a divine attribute, because nothing constrains them. They are indeed truly free. But of course, conversely, it's something bad, because it can result, ironically, in them becoming enslaved to the drive, to the lust, to the desire that propels them in the wrong direction. So, to that extent, indeed, we appreciate the fraught dimension that is introduced by eating the tree of knowing good and evil, the internalization of desire. We'll still need to consider whether this is indeed the same as what Rashi was describing as the internalization of the Yetzer. Ramban also notes in this regard the implications of a particularly fraught verse in Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, God made man upright, but they sought many devices. That God made man upright before man ate of the tree of knowing good and evil. But now that man is endowed with free will to choose on the level of the Yetzer HaRa, if you will, on the level of desire and lust, then they can seek all sorts of devices. They are by no means any longer constrained to that which is upright. This is, interestingly, an idea that, in a somewhat different vein, Ramban also discusses toward the end of the Barcelona disputation in Ma'amar HaVikuach, where he notes that the implications of being like God are not necessarily, of course, to become divine. And that it is in precisely that vein that we understand the seduction of you will be like God, knowing good and evil. There will be some dimension of commonality between you and God, which of course is what God is then enunciating and saying, behold, man has become as one of us. Not that man has become God, but rather that there is this unique, if you will, quasi-divine endowment that characterizes the human condition by dint of eating of the tree of knowing good and evil. Now, I just need to note here parenthetically, we talk about what transformation took place attendant to eating of the tree of knowing good and evil. So I already noted the comment of Rashi, the internalization of the Yetzer, the comment of Ramban, which is the internalization of desire. Rabbi Avraham ben Ezra expresses it in his Torah commentary in Bereshit, Genesis chapter 2, verse 17 in the regular recension of the commentary, verse 16 in the alternative version, that the transformation is the knowledge of sexual desire. So for Ibn Ezra, it is sexual desire. Arguably, what Ibn Ezra is saying and what Ramban is saying are certainly in synchrony with one another. Indeed, as we already noted, Ramban explicitly understood the Ratzon as manifest with respect to sexual attraction. Ramban prefers to express it in the more expansive level of not exclusively referring to sexual lust, but desire in general. But still, nonetheless, there's obviously a commonality between those two interpretations. Rambam, in his commentary on the sin of Adam and Chava, which occupies the second chapter of the Moreh, understands the transformation attendant to eating of the tree of knowing good and evil as the imagination, the faculty of the imagination. Is Rambam's view completely divorced from the three that we already noted? No, because Rambam later on in the Moreh, later on in the guide, in the second unit of the guide in chapter 12, establishes a fascinating identity between Dimyon, the imagination, and the Yetzer HaRa, and the drive toward evil. So, of course, it then becomes elementary to draw a line of commonality between Rashi and Rambam. what Rashi describes in terms of the internalization of the Yetzer HaRa, Rambam casts in terms of the imagination, but the imagination is the Yetzer HaRa, according to Rambam. Question is, are we going to conflate Rashi / Rambam, imagination / Yetzer HaRa, with Ibn Ezra / Ramban, lust, desire, or are these two fundamentally different approaches? There may be multiple answers to this question, but I think there's one critical term that we need to drag into this arena that makes both of these approaches essentially one, and that is creativity. That creativity is the activity of the imagination is, of course, self-evident. That creativity is that with which we are endowed by dint of the Yetzer HaRa, besides Rambam telling you the imagination is the Yetzer HaRa, is, I think, also self-evident. Creativity, after all, is what most manifestly informs the very etymology of Yetzer. Yetzer, drive, from Yetzav, to form, to create. When we consider the approaches of Ibn Ezra and Ramban, to what extent will we regard creativity as relevant to them? Well, on some plane, inevitably, I'm going to state, libidinal sublimation is really the root of all creativity, is it not? So we would then inevitably expect to see the uniqueness of man manifest in terms of human creativity, and moreover, manifest in a manner that invokes the human capacity to create. So we first note in this regard the Mishnah at the end of the final tractate, Masechet of Ketzim, that tells us that in the future to come, God is going to bequeath upon each and every one of the righteous 310 worlds. Now we might well ask ourselves, whence do these worlds come? Who creates them? And the answer, I think, is inexorably emergent from Tractate Sanhedrin, where Rava tells us, if the righteous so desire, they could create worlds. And indeed, perhaps even more emphatically, in Midrash Tehillim, God, as it were, says to the righteous, Hare atem kayotzevi, you are like me. Just as I create worlds and revive the dead, so too you created beings. In Zohar, it is arguably even more extremely enunciated, commenting on the verse in the consolations of Yeshayahu, of Isaiah. The God says to Zion, you are my people. The exposition in Zohar is, read it not as Amiata, but rather as Imiata, you are with me. You are my partner. Just as I, through my utterance, make the heavens and the earth, so too you. There's a fascinating postscript on this statement in Zohar to which we will inevitably need to return. Zakain inun di mishtadli be'oraita. Meritorious are those who toil in the Torah. Now, what does toiling in the Torah do with this? Of course, you could say, well, what does it mean to be righteous? But why specifically Torah? And what are the implications of it? And inevitably, in this regard, we turn to a midrash in Parashat Bereshit. The midrash is in the Tanchuma, and it comments on a verse that, ironically, we already saw cited by Ramban, that the Lord made man upright, but they sought many devices. But the manner in which this verse is cited in the midrash is particularly tantalizing. The midrash is commenting on the divine assessment of man after having eaten of the tree of knowing good and evil. Again, God the Lord said, behold, man has become as one of us, to know good and evil. Comments to Midrash. This is that which Scripture states. Behold, only these have I found, that the Lord made man upright, but they sought many contrivances. Meaning, says the Midrash, the Holy One, blessed be He, who is called just and upright, created man only to be just and upright like Him. The very endowment of Tselem Elokim, the divine essence imprinted upon man, is to enable man to be like God. Now, wait a second. What's the context here? Again, remember, the context is God's evaluation of man not after creation, but after the sin. Man has become as one of us. Man has become as one of us to be just and upright, like us. After the sin? But after the sin means, using Rashi's formulation, which apparently seems to underlie the assumption of the Midrash here, after the internalization of the Yetzer. So inevitably, the next line of the Midrash is, and you may ask, why did God create the HaRa, regarding which we read that the Yetzer of the heart of man is evil from his youth? You say it's bad. Who can make it good? And says the Holy One of Blessed be He, you make it evil. There's nothing intrinsically that makes it evil. Why is it that a child of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 doesn't sin? Only from age 10 and up, and then he begins to cultivate the Yetzer. Now, let's consider what's going on here. What distinguishes the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old from the 10-year-old? Ironically, I remember many years ago, a principal of an elementary school told me, he doesn't understand how it could be that children could be so cherubic, so saintly through third grade, and then they get to fourth grade and they turn into animals. And I said, what's the surprise? It's an explicit midrash. Age 10. Age 10 is the age of transformation. What happens at age 10? Because we'll appreciate the beginning of the onset of puberty. Man becomes endowed initially on some early stage on the pathway to becoming capable of physically creating. Libidinal sublimation, to use the Freudian terminology, that endows man with the capacity to be creative altogether, for better and for worse. Now, it's for better or for worse. So God says, no one made it evil other than you. You made it bad. And if you want to say, wait, it's nature, I have no control. If you say, no man can help himself, says the Holy One, blessed be He, you made it bad. You made it evil. Why is it that when you were a child, you didn't sin, and then you grew up and you sinned? And the Midrash then goes on to present us with some culinary analogies. Foods that, as the Midrash describes them, are intrinsically bitter. And you go through a long, arduous process to make them palatable and consumable. And then the Midrash hits its high note by stating, by way of conclusion, God, as it were, says to man, and if the bitter things that I created you sweeten for your use, the Yetzer HaRa, which is given over into your hands, how much more so? What exactly is the how much more so a fortiori argument here? Very simple. God testifies that these foods really are bitter. They're intrinsically bitter. You have to change their nature in order to make them palatable. Not so with the Yetzer. What is it intrinsically? It intrinsically is nothing. It is whatever you choose to make it. Remember what we stated at the outset. The Yetzer is not evil. Rather, on the contrary, it is handed over to you. You do with it whatever you please. There's nothing at all that constrains it to be evil. On the contrary, what it reflects, and reflects so aptly in this midrashic source, is your capacity to create. What will you create with it? Whatever you please. good or bad. It's up to you. In something of a similar vein, of Hirsch comments regarding the verse that describes the creation of man in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. The Yetzer HaRa, sensuality in itself, is not Ra. Every inclination, as long as the miyusar is from the Yetzer, creator, is pure and holy. Vayitzer, God forming man. The same one who created the one inclination created the other. The whole idea of the sensuous nature of man belonging to Satan or originating from Satan is something that comes from a completely different place than Jewish teachings. And Rav Hirsch describes it as a contorted conception which has been invented to the curse of mankind and is antithetical to what the Torah tells us, that both inclinations come from God's hands. And there's nothing at all that compels the one to be good and the other to be evil. It's completely up to us. Small wonder then that the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, tells us in Tractate Brachot and Tractate Sotah that Abraham, made his Yetzer Ra good. Because after all, nothing ever constrained it to be bad. And not at all incidental, this idea is enunciated with respect to Abraham. We have a whole slew of midrashic sources. We won't go through them in detail inside because our time is limited. But the idea that Abraham is the paradigm of the one who is able to intuit Torah, who connects with Torah, as it were, through his own self. His own innards become well springs of Torah. And that's critical. Because if you're going to connect with Torah, you need your Yetzer HaRa. But it's not evil. You make it good. And that serves as the basis of the connection. And indeed, this is something that is enunciated not only with respect to Abraham, the individual, but his descendants collectively as the nation. In the Midrash, in Psikta Rabati, when Israel stood at Sinai and they committed themselves to the acceptance of the Torah, says the Midrash, the Yetzer HaRa was immediately uprooted from them, not in the sense of being canceled, but rather in the sense that the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Ra that were within them both became a single-minded heart of Yetzer Tov. The Yetzer Ra became good because it's the source of human creativity. And that creativity is being applied in a positive dimension. That realization that, again, I'm going to emphasize by way of summation, embraces all four of the interpretations that we saw of what the transformation was that took place in man, attendant to eating the tree of knowing good and evil. It is the Yetzer HaRa, but that's another way of saying imagination, tells us Rambam. But it's, after all, that creative energy that is manifest in lust and desire, because that's what makes you into a creative being. You aren't simply subject to someone or something else. There's an internal dynamo that you have over which you can take control. Because as we saw in the Midrash, the Yetzer HaRa is handed over to you. You do with it whatever you want. Nothing at all constrains it to be one thing or another. It's completely up to you. But of course, that in itself gives you the challenge. What indeed are you going to do with it? It shouldn't be at all a surprise to us when we consider that threshold age that was enunciated in the Midrash of age 10, that we find something else about age 10 that is directly germane for our project of connecting the Yetzer HaRa with Torah. And that is the Mishnah in the 5th chapter of Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, that tells us that a 5-year-old is ready to study scripture, but only a 10-year-old is ready to study Mishnah. And if we ask ourselves, what fundamentally is the difference between studying scripture and studying Mishnah, I feel compelled to invoke Piagetian terminology of the great developmental psychologist of the last generation, Jean Piaget, that a youngster, 5-6-year-old, is capable of engaging in concrete operations. That is, the concrete manipulation of tangible, concrete concepts, but not abstraction. For that, you need to attain the formal operation stage, the ability to abstract, which takes place at around age 10 or 11. To study scripture is concrete. Age 5 is adequate. It's to study the principles of the oral tradition. Mishnah, you have to be at least 10. And of course, inevitably, not at all incidentally, it is the 10-year-old endowed with the Yetzer HaRa, as the Midrash expressed it, who is now capable of studying the oral Torah. On a more cryptic plane, Zohar tells us that from the aspect of the tree of knowing good and evil comes Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is considered the foundation of the oral tradition. And likewise, Zohar says, that which is forbidden and that which is permitted, that which is acceptable, that which is invalid, that which is pure, that which is defiled, that is, all these constructs ultimately are constructs that pertain to the abstractions of the oral Torah. And whence do they come? They come from the tree of knowing good and evil. This is an idea that Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen Milublin, one of the great Hasidic masters of the late 19th century, explicitly enunciates, that Torah shebe'al peh comes from the aspect of the tree of knowing good and evil. And of course, inevitably, we juxtapose to that another statement that he makes, which is that the essence of Torah is the oral Torah. And this is innovated exclusively by means of the Yetzer HaRa, the tree of knowing good and evil. Now, this isn't something that is unique to the Hasidic houses of study. The Vilna Gaon enunciates this principle explicitly in his commentary on Agadah in Tractate Berachot, that all the work of creation is tov me'od. We know what that means. Very good. Because the Yetzer HaRa also aids the righteous. And the essence of their service of God is through it, as is known. In that vein, we can well appreciate the idea enunciated in Midrash HaNe'elam, again, part of the corpus of Zohar literature. First, we'll cite Midrash HaNe'elam on Parashat Chayei Sarah, that the Yetzer HaRa is not, in the end, annulled. Even though in the world of the future, most of it is not manifest, some of it is. On some plane, it is described as being whitened, being purified, as one who cleanses himself of his defilement. That aspect of the Yetzer HaRa persists. In what vein? Cite from a little bit later in Midrash HaNe'elam, 10 folios downwind, in Midrash HaNe'elam on Parashat Toldot, the statement that we already noted at the outset, that the Yetzer HaRa is as necessary for the world as rain is for the world. For were it not for the Yetzer HaRa, the rejoicing in Torah law would not be. But it won't be in the defiled state that it was previously. Rather, on the contrary, this is what is intimated in Yeshayahu, in Isaiah chapter 11, they will do no evil nor corrupt in all of my holy mountain. The Yetzer HaRa purified. But note also the metaphor. The Yetzer HaRa is as necessary for the world as rain is for the world. What is rain? Rain is the means for everything to create, everything to be fruitful. So too the Yetzer HaRa. It is the means for being able to create. And of course, it's in that vein that we can well appreciate the implication of a number of sources that we have, that the only way you could possibly get to Torah is through the Yetzer HaRa. So the Yetzer HaRa is means to the attainment of Torah. The Gemara that perhaps more than any other speaks of the Yetzer HaRa is in Tractate Sukkah on page 52, 52a, 52b. It speaks of the Yetzer HaRa as, on the one hand, that which destroyed the first temple, destroyed the second temple, caused unmitigated grief and suffering, specifically slew the Torah scholars. As if there's this specific connection between the Yetzer and the Torah scholars. The Gemara goes on to emphasize it doesn't set its sights on the nations of the world so much as upon Israel. It refers euphemistically to the enemies of Israel, but it means Israel. And Torah scholars more than anyone else. Who has the greatest Yetzer? The Torah scholar has the greatest Yetzer. In what vein? Principle. Whoever is greater than his fellow has a greater Yetzer. Just consider, if you have a muscle and you ignore it, that muscle will atrophy. If you want that muscle to get big, you got to use it. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. You have a muscle to be creative. That's the Yetzer HaRa. If you don't use it, if you squander it, if you don't do anything with your life, then the Yetzer HaRa can atrophy, become inconsequential. When you use it, when you harness it, it gets stronger. Of course, your ability to control it also becomes stronger. There's no one who exploits one's Yetzer HaRa more than a Torah scholar, constantly creating through the Yetzer HaRa. And it is in that vein that the same passage in the Gemara tells us, if this repulsive one bumps into you, the Yetzer HaRa, drag it into the Beit Midrash. Drag it into the Midrash. If anything, you might say, run away from it to the Beit Midrash. Why drag it into the Beit Midrash? Well, essentially, answers Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen Milublin, if you're going to run away from it into the Beit Midrash, once you get into the Beit Midrash, what are you going to do there? You don't have the Yetzer HaRa. You're not going to be able to do anything. Then on the contrary, the goal of the Yetzer HaRa, the tachlit, the utmost purpose for which it is created, is to be that desire and longing for the Torah, to take the lustful desire that is the essence of the Yetzer HaRa and dedicate it to loving the Torah, to creating Torah, to indeed the engagement that brings out the fullness of the Yetzer HaRa, and of course, brings out the fullness of the person endowed with it, the utmost level of self-actualization. So don't run away from the Yetzer HaRa into the Beit Midrash. You have to take the Yetzer HaRa with you if you're going to be doing anything constructive in the Beit Midrash. If I could just add to this a brief anecdotal note. For many, many years, I had a very, very dear chavruta, Rav Matas Greenblatt, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, who unfortunately passed away just over a year ago. And he had a very intimate bond with Rav Yitzchak Kotner, Zichrono Livracha, his Rosh Yeshiva. And I remember him relating to me that when Rav Hutner was a young man, he of course was studying in Slobodka under the tutelage of the Alter of Slobodka, and one day the Alter sees that Rav Hutner is, as a young boy, young man, sitting by himself. So he goes up and says, "Where's your chavrusa? Where's your study partner?" So Rav Hutner responds, "My study partner is my Yetzer HaRa." So the Alter, without missing a beat, asks, "Why not your Yetzer Tov?" And Rav Hutner, without missing a beat, says, "Because my Yetzer HaRa is sharper." So again, this principle that you have to use your Yetzer HaRa, that's the utmost chavrusa, that's the utmost study partner in order to be able to grow in Torah. So there is this aspect then that is enunciated in all these sources that essentially the Yetzer HaRa is the means to the attainment of Torah. Tantalizingly, we also find the converse. That is, that the Torah is the means to the fullness of the Yetzer HaRa. When the Gemara tells us it is inconceivable for there to be a house of study without novel interpretation. The essence of Torah is to attain that novel interpretation, but that means that the novelty is engendered through Torah. It is actualized through the Yetzer HaRa. Even more so, the Baraita in Avot Rabbi Natan tells us, to what can the Yetzer Hara be likened? To iron that is cast into a furnace. As long as it is in the furnace, you can make of it whatever vessels you please. So too the Yetzer Hara, it has no refinement other than through words of Torah that are like fire. Now note, this is an inversion here. The Yetzer Hara here isn't in a supporting role for Torah. Torah is in a supporting role for the Yetzer Hara. In order to get to the fullness of the Yetzer Hara, you need Torah, because otherwise the Yetzer Hara is just going to be a hunk of metal. Varying the metaphor. The Midrash, likewise the Gemara, famously employ the metaphor of Torah as tavlin. That God says to Israel, my children, I created for you the Yetzer Hara. I created Torah as its tavlin. For some reason, one often finds translations rendering tavlin here as antidote. Antidote? Since when does tavlin mean antidote? Ridiculous. Tavlin means spice. In other words, I created for you the Yetzer Hara, and I created Torah to spice it up. Because without Torah, the Yetzer Hara is tasteless. Tasteless in the pejorative sense as well. Also in the literal sense, it is insipid. It's specifically through the engagement in Torah that you're able to fully actualize the Yetzer Hara. Indeed, thus, the comment is cited in the name of the Magid Mimezrich that tavlin, spice, is what gives taste to the essential food. So too, a person needs to serve God with all of the enthusiasm that he has from the Yetzer Hara. So the focus is on the Yetzer Hara, except that enthusiasm needs to be spiced with Torah and mitzvot, and then the service is complete because he's transforming the darkness into light. The Yetzer Hara without Torah is simply insipid and tasteless. So inevitably, it raises the question, so which is there in the supporting role and which is the primary role? That is, in the first set of sources that we saw, the Yetzer Hara was means to the actualization of Torah. But in these sources, on the contrary, the Torah is means to the actualization of the Yetzer Hara. Which is it? Of course, inevitably the answer is yes. That is, the Midrash tells us that the Torah is called stone and the Yetzer Hara is called the stone, and thus the stone should watch over the stone. Which stone watches over which stone? If the metaphors are identical, it gets confusing, doesn't it? But of course, inevitably the answer is both. The Torah and the Yetzer Hara are interdependent. You can only actualize Torah through the Yetzer Hara. You can only actualize your Yetzer Hara through Torah. Ultimately, you can only actualize yourself through both. And of course, it is in this vein that we can appreciate the thrust of the Midrash and Tanat Ve'Eliyahu Rabbah, that were not for the Yetzer Hara, all of that honor that is vouchsafed for Israel would not be. Citing an almost contemporary source, as the Chazon Ish expressed it, the utmost goal of man is the Yetzer. One who doesn't have a Yetzer doesn't have a soul. So you need the Yetzer and you need the Torah to direct it, both together. And of course, it is in that vein that, returning to Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen Milublin, we appreciate a string of sources, which I'm just going to note very briefly because our time is really run out, that the thrust of the Yetzer Hara dragged into the Beit Midrash is precisely the means through which the Yetzer Hara becomes Tov Me'od, that very good. And in that vein, it is likewise the spice of Torah that makes the food, the Yetzer Hara, into Tov Me'od, because all of his desire becomes a desire for words of Torah. And moreover, that there is no loftier level than to inject holiness into every dimension of one's physicality. and through doing so, to attain that level of Tov Me'od that transcends any other level of holiness. So, again, Torah, Yetzer HaRa, together, the self-actualization. The self-actualization that we celebrate on Shavuot. Because, hey, you can learn Torah any day. But if you're not going to engage in that self-indulgence, to drive home this message, it is specifically through Torah that you actualize yourself because of the Yetzer HaRa. Not self-denial. There's so many people out there who think that Torah is a relentless message of self-abnegation and self-denial. Nonsense! On the contrary, what they think is self-indulgence isn't self-indulgence. It's a different kind of slavery. The true liberation, the true self-indulgence, self-actualization, what you really are, is the conflation of Torah and the Yetzer HaRa together. Indeed, there's an interesting message emergent in the Gemara, tells us that while Gentiles are welcome to bring offerings to the Holy Temple, they don't bring shlamim, the peace offerings, where the owner partakes of the offering himself. And indeed, if they dedicate a shlamim offering to the temple, it is brought on the holy altar as a burnt offering. This informs Ramban's commenting that Jethro, in described as bringing zvachim, which means shlamim, in the lead up to the Torah's description of the revelation at Sinai, either has done all of this long before the Torah was given, and therefore both Israel and he are at some pre-Torah level, or it's after the giving of the Torah, and Yitro is also after he's accepted the Torah. Because to be able to engage in eating, in self-indulgence as a spiritual act, doesn't compute until you have the Torah. There isn't anything intrinsically unique about Israel, except that God gave us the Torah. That enables us to sit down to a sumptuous dinner table as an act of pure devotion. And to that extent, indeed, the Torah is the key to that self-actualization that is specifically reflected in the Yetzer HaRa. Just perhaps a way of summation, to consider a somewhat enigmatic comment that we encounter in Masechet Smachot and in the Gemara and in Sota and in Sanhedrin, that there are three things in which you need to have an ambivalence of the left pushing away, but the stronger hand bringing close. The first on the list is the Yetzer. The right hand draws it close. Why is it the right hand that draws it close? Because after all, the Gemara tells us the Torah was given through the right. The right hand that gives us the Torah is likewise the right hand that draws the Yetzer HaRa close. Parenthetically, this has nothing to do with lefties versus righties, because for lefty, this is the right hand. That's beside the point. The critical point for us to appreciate, again, is it is the same right hand that gives us the Torah, that draws close the Yetzer HaRa, that provides us with the utmost recipe for true self-actualization. Chag Shavuot Sameach.